Hello and welcome. I'm Rami Niranjan Desai, and this is the first of a series of interviews I will be doing with key policymakers and influencers in the critical Australia India relationship, one of the most important strategic and people to people relationships in the Indo Pacific. In this interview, we have a very special guest with us, Dr. Robert Glasser. Dr. Glasser is the head of the Climate and Security Policy Centre in the Australia Strategic Policy Institute, or ASPI, based out of Canberra. Welcome, Dr. Glasser. Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure, Ron. Thank you for having me.
Not at all. Dr. Glasser, let me begin by asking you. You were, until recently, the special representative of the Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction and Assistant Secretary General and head of the United Nations Office of Disaster Risk Reduction. So, allow me to begin with a fairly broad question. Why does it seem like, in spite of evidence everywhere, countries and societies just don't seem to be taking the global warming seriously?
I think it's a difficult question to answer, but I think part of it is the fact that there isn't one moment at which this disaster is arriving on us. It's a steadily building disaster. I wrote an article once that had conducted this thought experiment that I said if there was a comet heading towards Earth and all the world scientists saw it and were certain about when it would arrive, it would hit on a certain moment in time, and there was absolute certainty, and that it would cause all the sorts of disruptions we're thinking about and what scientists are telling us will happen with climate change. It would just happen all at once. There's little doubt in my mind that the world would join together to try and intercept this comet and stop it. But the fact that climate is this steadily warming disaster makes it much harder to mobilize public action. It seems like a distant threat, even though, as you know, these impacts are happening more and more frequently now, the disaster impacts.
Absolutely. Recently I read a report by the Asian Development Bank, which said something to the effect of that about 225 million displacements have happened in Asia and in the Pacific in the last 10 years. What do you think is the anticipated pattern for the next decade?
I think one of the issues that is greatly underappreciated in the public consciousness, but also among policymakers, is how rapidly climate impacts are accelerating. These impacts are now occurring non-linearly, which means our human nature tells us that we look back and say, what's happened over the last 5 or 10 years? And that's what we pretty much assume that pace of change we assume for the future. But that's absolutely and fatally wrong in the case of climate change. The pace is now increasing non-linearly, which means these impacts are going to be appearing, these very extreme impacts, much more rapidly than people realize. Population displacements, impact on food security, and of course, natural disasters that are contributing to the mix.
India and Australia obviously play a crucial role, especially on the Indo-Pacific. And they're increasingly becoming very strong partners, major partners in energy, not only coal, which was traditionally always there, but also critical minerals like lithium. How do you see this partnership developing, evolving?
Well, there are two dimensions to this issue and the motivation behind this. Well, the three motivations. One, of course, is climate change and moving to renewables, which renewable energy technologies rely on these rare earth minerals. The second is relates to China and the geopolitics of China in the region. China has a commanding control over renewable technologies, rare earth minerals, and the industrial capacity to produce these things. So there are two aspects to that issue. One is this idea of whether China would use this as geopolitical leverage in regional crises. But the one I would focus on more is just the risk globally of having so much capacity in the renewables area focused in one country, and in some cases in one factory in one country. That's if this were your portfolio, you would want to diversify that risk. And if I were China, I would want to diversify that risk within my own country, let alone leaving aside the geopolitical challenges that I mentioned.
Quite right. So, what do you think are the other ways that Australia and India can play a larger role in maybe cooperation on climate change? And what do you think they've already done some work together and have intentions to do more? What do you think that they've done that is relatively less noticed but should be highlighted?
Well, India has, not surprisingly, enormous capacity in the area of disaster preparedness and response. They've been absolutely, we're falling behind in disaster risk reduction in many, many areas, but one in which we're not is this capacity for early warning and evacuating large populations, putting in place cyclone shelters. There are a whole series of measures that India is leading the world in preparing for disaster and reducing disaster risk that has accounted for this remarkable decrease in fatalities from these disasters, including cyclones, that 20 years ago caused tens of thousands of deaths. And now the same tracks of the cyclone are very similar in intensities where we don't see the loss of life. So this is an area where India, first of all, can play a leadership role in the region, particularly with cyclones apparently, according to the climate science, becoming more intense as a result of climate warming. And of course, there are huge areas of cooperation between India and Australia on the energy transformation, which is essential, including there's an initiative, as you probably know, this Just Transition Technology Partnership of the G7, which is also engaging India. But Australia and India have an important role to play. Australia is a supplier as a country endowed with rare earth minerals and with the potential for green hydrogen development, which is underway now. And so that cooperation on the energy transformation, which is so essential if we're to prevent more dangerous climate warming, I think is a key area of focus for the relationship.
How far do you think we really are in making this happen or, working it to the full of its capacity?
In terms of the bilateral connections or globally? Bilateral. Yeah, I think, globally, we're clearly not on track to make this happen. There was an emissions gap report that UNEP, the United Nations Environment Program, just put out that showed that even if countries maintain their existing commitments and actually implemented what they said they would do, which is sadly unlikely, our climate is on track to warm between 2.5 and 3 degrees, which would be truly catastrophic in places like South Asia, but in Australia as well. So yes, we're not on track. And in terms of India and Australia, I think there is so much room for further cooperation, both in terms of sharing technology and approaches within our two countries, but also in working collaboratively in the region to support other nations that are trying to make both the energy transformation and prepare for climate impacts that are intensifying non-linearly, as I mentioned a moment ago. So I think there's enormous potential and I think great will, certainly in Australia, and I know in India as well, to further build this partnership.
Absolutely. But, could you elaborate a little bit more on, how, in what ways could Australia and India further develop and strengthen their cooperation on climate change, especially on issues like solar power, EVs, and other such areas? The two countries have already signed a letter of intent on collaboration on renewable energy.
Yeah, I think so. If we look at the range of technologies required for the renewable energy transition, they start with rare earth minerals, and Australia, I think, has the 5th largest reserve globally of rare earth minerals that are absolutely fundamental to solar cell technology and links to battery storage technology. So I think at that very basic level of providing an alternative source of these minerals, that are critical for the transformation, there's an important partnership there. I think also in terms of the solar energy technologies, Australia's also developed many technologies in this area. And now there's a big increase in investment in renewable R&D in Australia. So I think there are opportunities to collaborate with India on sharing technology and ideas at the R&D level. And then in terms of the deployment, Australia, there's some billion-dollar investments that some of Australia's largest firms are making in hydrogen, in green hydrogen right now. And I think there are opportunities. There are opportunities for Australia to join with India in this technology to promote this transition, which is seen as one of the most effective way of actually moving green energy around efficiently, as opposed to relying on sunlight, for example, and just the battery storage technologies. And of course, this green hydrogen can be used to power economic development, which is so critical in producing steel and other products that without emitting the greenhouse gases that are result from using fossil fuels to do that. So I really think it's a wide open opportunity for the two countries.
I'm also really interested in understanding how, developing countries, there seems to have been a failure in adapting some amount of, mainstreaming climate change within developing countries and economies. How do you think this could be sort of maybe accelerated a little bit?
Wow, I asked this question about my own country because I just read an article today that there's a new development plan in Brisbane along a major river basin that almost certainly will be flooding again and more frequently as a result of climate change in the future. Of course, it's hard to say at a local level, but and part of the reason this is happening is because we haven't been mainstreaming climate. Because if you mainstream climate, development involves, for your listeners' sake, viewers' sake, the understanding the hazards. And traditionally, the way we've done that, hazards like floods or cyclone risk, is by looking historically at where these hazards have struck, how often, how bad they've been. And then we produce these maps, hazard maps that say, don't build your houses along this river in this area, because you will be flooded every 20 years or 50 years or 100 years. But with climate change, you can't rely on that history anymore. And what is, in terms of storm surge, for example, the UN science says that what is currently a 1 in 100 year extreme flooding event will very soon become annual events in many parts of the world because of the increasing climate risk, sea level rise, for example. So if we were mainstreaming climate in our development, then we would be using the best science to redraw our mapping of where you should not be developing. We're not placing populations or new developments or hospitals and we're not doing that. So to answer your question, how can we do that better? I think by making people more aware of the risks with better climate modeling, that will help. But the political support will only happen, I think, sadly, after major disasters. When we see these areas becoming flooded more and more often, the public demands action and there are changes that are put in place. In developing countries, sometimes there isn't a strong civil society to advocate for those changes. So this becomes very difficult. But as soon as the costs go up, then it does tend to focus governments that want to have more efficient development. So I think those are the two paths: greater knowledge of risk and the increasing disasters that will focus people's attention.
Quite right, Dr. Glasser. But let me again come back to India and Australia. There's also been this increasing conversation in Australia about expanding the use of nuclear power. What is your opinion on this? Is this an area where Australia and India could cooperate?
First of all, it's a very controversial issue in Australia, and I suspect in segments in India as well, the population. It's partly, and this has become sensitive as a result of a variety of problems with nuclear, starting way back with Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island, Fukushima reactor after the Great Eastern Japan earthquake and tsunami, and even in the Ukraine now with this discussion about the potential attacks or disruptions to this very large nuclear power plant in the Ukraine. So there's a very strong emotional bias against nuclear energy, and not to mention the storage of the waste material and so on. However, if I ask many of my climate scientist friends, they are really surprised that there isn't more support for nuclear energy, because they take they have a risk focus. They look at the costs of fossil fuels in terms of air quality, increased lung cancers, and the accidents in mines that kill hundreds of workers each year. And they compare that to the nuclear energy challenge, and they see a gap. They just find it very difficult to understand this as a rational response, particularly given the huge threat climate change represents. So I think but for me, one of the fundamental questions is the cost of deploying this the nuclear technology, even new technologies. And I think when I look at the rapidly decreasing cost of renewables, I just think in many, many cases, it will not make economic sense to invest in a nuclear plant when the costs of renewables are dropping so rapidly. So that's my short response, or somewhat short response to your question.
But finally, let me ask you this, Dr. Glasser. If the Quad had to develop a robust climate change agenda, what do you think it should contain?
Number one, I think it would require a climate and security risk assessment done collectively. Ideally, this should be done regionally, but maybe we could start with the Quad. Australia is developing its first climate security risk assessment that's looking at the regions and what does this world look like with climate change. So I think that we first need a common understanding of what the risks are, and they are enormous in terms of population displacement, food insecurity, the energy transformation, trade. There are enormous risks. With that understanding of the risks, then I think it's easier to develop a shared agenda for responses. First, there's a question of jointly prioritizing the investments, and clearly the energy transformation, supporting that in other countries, in our own countries and in other countries, will be key. Secondly, I think it will focus on fundamentals of disaster response and how India and Australia can both play a more active role in helping respond to disasters in our immediate regions. Thirdly, should focus on these major systemic regional disruptions that are coming. One relates to food security, and that's a very important one. In many countries, as you probably know, the rising cost of fuel or food is a cause of instability, political instability, let alone a humanitarian disaster, but also a cause of political instability and, in many countries, conflict. So I think the focus on food and here India has enormous technical knowledge of drought-resistant and flood-resistant crops and those sorts of things. Australia as well, more drought-resistant because we live in a very dry continent. It's a natural match, I think, for working in the region on these broader systemic challenges that are coming. There are so many other ways we could cooperate because this change is not an environment change. It's not a change that is a natural disasters change. It's a whole system change. The geopolitics of the region will transform. I use this analogy of a chessboard. If you think of, say, competition with China or any other great powers as moving pieces on the chessboard, climate change is upending the chessboard. We can move the pieces, but if we don't take account of climate change, all those pieces will be on the floor.
Quite right. Well said, Dr. Glasser. I think that was really insightful. Thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you so much for your time. I know this has been a really busy day for you. I really appreciate it. We will be bringing so many interviews like this on this channel with key people to help you understand one of the fastest growing relationships between two of the largest democracies in the world. That is the friendship between Australia and India. Thank you for watching. I'm Rami Niranjan Desai.